Hello, thank you for the opportunity to give comments on this paper. I'm really sorry I can't be there in person. I've been asked to comment on the overview, give a brief overview of the study, introduce the broad conceptual landscape of the study, talk a little bit about how the study makes its contribution, and then also I will then fourthly comment on other African contexts that could usefully make use of the ideas in this study. So a snapshot of what the paper does, new insights into how social responsibility organizations prefigure alternatives to the prevailing business practice. So namely, it is about replacing a formal currency, Kenyan shillings, with an informal currency. And it considers how the Kenyan banking system and its current services to the poor who were not benefiting from those banking practices, i.e. the use of the formal Kenyan shilling currency. An informal currency is developed and then integrated into a blockchain, and eventually this blockchain fails. The paper develops a framework capturing how social organizations use imaginaries to pre-configure alternative actions, such as setting up new types of practices around currency. So a couple of interesting points that I picked up on the methods. Firstly, I thought it was very interesting that a Kenyan-based research associate was the one centrally involved in the fieldwork data collection. I also thought it was interesting that much of the in-person fieldwork was done during COVID, and that COVID also coincides with the failed implementation of blockchain. Another interesting note with the use of blogs and videos, which is less typically noted as a kind of. So comments on the broad conceptual area. So there are two concepts that are used in this paper to develop the theoretical framework. One is prefiguration theories, and the other is imaginaries. Prefiguration can be understood as enacting some desired future in the present, and it is enacting this in an effort to make the desired future a dominant reality. This requires two angles. One is enacting, so action, and then also anticipating, which is future directed. Imaginaries, the second conceptual space, can be broadly construed as systems of meanings that do not constitute a current reality, and imaginaries are mobilized to transform the present into a different future. So in these broad conceptual areas, an important note is that they are profoundly temporal concepts, and these temporal concepts are anchored both in the present and in the future, and in some instances it could be also the past, though the past is not developed as an important part of this particular study. They are about how the present might become changed by envisioning and bringing into being a different future. So another point that I'd like to make about the conceptual space is that both of the theoretical perspectives, i.e. prefiguration and imaginaries, are fundamentally concerned with how agentic resources can or may be created. So for example, an actor, where might they gain resource to garner some sort of change? This could be from an imaginary, for example, a utopian vision of how a system of currency ought to operate. It could also be from anticipatory focused action, i.e. anticipating what might happen and acting as if that is going to happen. As an aside, not fleshed out in this paper, but one way to capitalize on developing these conceptual areas is to develop linkage with Byron Mish's seminal paper on the linkage between temporality and agency. So the conversations this paper joins is around prefiguration and imaginaries scholarship, And the conversation is developed by teasing out the linkages and the insight that you can derive from developing the relationship between these two. So the relationship between figuration and imaginaries. Another conversation joined is that of CSR, corporate social responsibility, a different stream of work. CSR is concerned with those organizations or aspects of an organization that focus on developing social value. And this is developed in the paper through the insights into how a grassroots organization might engage with CSR. So the type of contribution, and here I'm speaking really to the first bullet point, is the paper makes the contribution by adding new insight to existing perspectives in these two literatures. So as a high-level example, we know A from the literature, and now we know more. We know A plus B. And this new knowledge is gained by expanding the relational linkage between prefiguration and imaginaries. And they do that by drawing on this very interesting case of grassroots CSR. So I note in the slide the other ways that contributions can be made, which is to contradict current literature or to bring together two literature streams that have not been connected. A few important insights that I would like to note from the paper. First, it gives voice to an interesting understudied phenomenon. It explains why things go wrong, i.e. unintended consequences. It provides insight into what can give agency for change, and it is very attentive to relational dynamics, and that is contribution. Other contexts in African-based research where these ideas might apply, I would suggest two. One might be entrepreneurship in an African context. Entrepreneurship is, in my view, very prefiguratively orientated. It can entail prefigurative action in terms of working towards the desired future. The entrepreneurial intention is to make a new business. It is not yet in place, and therefore it is seeking a different future in the present. So some of these ideas could be very useful. I think another area which is important in African context is looking at ecosystem development or possibly orchestration. These are slightly different literatures, and looking at that in emerging African economies. And ecosystems require networks and collaborations through which value can be co-created or developed through the collaborations. But these collaborations may not yet be existing in the present to yield the value. And hence, it needs to prefigure or imagine how these ecosystem networks should be collaborating and the value that should be construed. They're not based on current value. Knowing also which entities will be best placed to join or become enrolled into the ecosystem is also difficult in the present, because you have to apprehend in advance what kind of value might be developed in the future. This is particularly so in digital-based ecosystems, or where digital phenomena are important in the development of the ecosystems, because these are fundamentally unspecified. The digital can be repurposed and reshaped in unintended ways. Some questions for me about this paper, which don't have to be answered, but I thought I'd throw my hat in for a few points. The paper states that it's transitioning from paper-based community currency to a digital token is what is being looked at. And my question is, were the people and the businesses not already using M-Pesa, which is a digital form? The paper focuses on the move from paper to digital, it says, where the Kenyan majority are already in their GDP using the digitally mediated M-Pesa, and which bypasses the current banking system. So I didn't understand that move. And then there's also a large IS literature on technology hype and the way that tech bubbles inevitably do burst. To what extent in the paper might the failure of blockchain be the traditional technology failing to deliver type of challenge that we have quite a few studies about, rather than the challenge of scaling upwards? A few thoughts to think about. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you. And I'm sorry I can't be there in person. I hope you have a really good seminar session.